Hey everyone, and welcome to the Rules of Chess Explained. I'm Grandmaster Max Illingworth, and by the end of this video, you will be ready to start playing a game of chess against your friends or on the internet. So let's begin by learning how to play chess. The great thing about playing chess is it is so much fun to play. It really stimulates the brain, and it's basically a universal language for which we can talk with anyone else around the world on the chessboard. So, getting into how to play chess, you can see that this is the starting position that you're going to see when you are playing chess, over the board against people face to face, or in times of COVID, playing online on the internet, which I will show you how to do at the end of this video. As for the rules, the thing to keep in mind is that there are different pieces, and let's tell you about each of these pieces and how they move. And our first piece is how the rook moves. And this is the white rook I've highlighted in yellow, and the black rook that I've highlighted in red. And the rook is actually a pretty easy piece to move because it basically moves vertically and horizontally, up and down, left and right. So, for example, a move for white rook would be, for example, to move the rook like this. So then how does the black rook move? Well, it moves exactly the same way, up and down the board, left and right. And the rook also captures the same way that it moves. So let's say, for example, that after the rook moves, that black moves their rook to some square. Then we would capture in the same way, where the rook could capture the pawn in this case. Note that the rook is not able to jump over pieces. So, for example, the rook could not move past this black pawn that is in the way at the moment. So that is how the rook moves. Let's see how some of the other pieces move as well. So now we have the bishop. And the bishop is another piece that's pretty easy to learn the moves for, because the bishop moves on its diagonal. So the bishop moves diagonally, where we can see that these squares I'm highlighting are called the light squares, whereas for the black bishop moves along the dark squares, and you can see the different legal moves it has by the squares that I'm highlighting here. So for example, a move for the white bishop could be to move the bishop here, and black in turn could move the bishop. You can see here when I hold the bishop, you can see the different squares in green where that bishop can legally move. To say the bishop moves here. And we can see that the bishop captures the same way that it moves, where we can capture the pawn like this, but as you can see the bishop, had all these different moves on the diagonal. So you get the idea of how the bishop moves, that just moves along the diagonals. It can move as many squares along that diagonal as it likes, as long as it's not obstructed by a piece, because the bishop cannot jump over other pieces or its own pieces. So let's go on to the next piece. So let's see how the queen moves here. Now, the queen is another one that is actually the most powerful piece. The queen has all the power, as Niles once said. And basically, the queen moves like a combined rook. So it moves up and down, left and right. And it also moves like a bishop, so along the diagonals here. So to give an example, the white queen could move, let's say, along diagonal here. And for the black queen, it moves the same way, where I'm just going to show you how the queen captures as well. Where it turns out the queen actually captures the same way as it moves. So if black were to put the queen here, then white would be able to take the queen. But as you can see, it wouldn't be able to jump over that queen, as it were. So queen takes queen. And obviously with capturing, you can only capture the opponent's pieces. You're not allowed to take your own pieces. If you're getting really frustrated, that's not a way you can take it out. But okay, these jokes aside, let's move on to our next example of seeing... Well, this is how the queen moves. Again, we can see the captures at play, where white queen can take the black pawn, and the black queen can take the white pawn here. Now let's move on to the next piece, and see how the next piece moves. So, just going to move forward here. There we go. And now we're going to learn how the king moves. And you'll notice the way I've basically shown the order, that we're kind of adding a little building block, that the way the next piece moves is often very similar to how the previous piece moved. And the king is kind of like a queen with a walking stick, If you have a walking stick and you can't move quickly, you can't just jump around the board up or down like that. That's for the queen to do. The king is more like kind of the guy with a walking stick, where he can move like a queen, but only moving one square in each direction. So, for example, in this position, white would, for instance, be able to move his king, let's say like this, for example, just for argument's sake. And then for the black king moves in the same way. Now, there is an important difference to keep in mind. with the kings compared to the other pieces that I will get into a little bit more later. But it's worth pointing out that white would not be able to put his king on f3 in this position, and we'll understand why when we understand that basically the king is not able to put itself in a position where it could be taken on the next move. And we'll get more into that a little bit later, because we'll see how the pawn moves in a moment. But there's one thing to keep in mind, that basically you are not able to put your king in a position where it can be captured in a game of chess. So moving on to the next piece. Now we have the knight. And the knight is probably the favorite piece of a lot of young kids. And that's because the knight has some special powers that the other pieces don't have. It also has a somewhat more tricky movement. So if we look at where the knight can move, basically it moves in an L shape. Kind of like, well, let's draw an L like this would be, an example of the L shape there as such, where it makes that move in one move. And if we actually just indicate all of the different 8 squares that the knight can move to from this position, one thing you'll notice is that the knight basically kind of moves like 2 squares in one direction and then 1 to the side in the other. Like here and then 1 to the left or 1 to the right. And it can also work it the other way, where another way I think is it moves 1 square in one direction and then 2 to the side from that is another way you can do it. So basically you can also notice, and this is something that will really help you if you're wanting to figure out whether your knight move was legal or whether the opponent's knight move was a legal move, is you'll notice that the knight is currently on a light square, but when it moves from a light square to a dark square, and then from there the knight in turn moves to a light square from a dark square, and the knight, it turns out, captures the same way that it moves. So for example, if knight e6, this is actually an instructive point, and this is where the knight is really different to the other pieces, in that the knight is actually able to jump over other pieces, where in this case we can actually use the knight to jump over their knight and then take their pawn. So we see the knight captures, and it can jump over pieces, which is a pretty cool thing. So for example, you could have like a little pirouette with the knights where this knight could jump over the other knight and then go like this. So that's what's really unique about the knight, and how it has, unlike any of the other pieces, that even if the knight's move to its square is blocked, you can still jump over and make the move anyway, which can be really shock some opponents. So let's get into the next example of how the pawn moves. Now the pawn actually is a piece that is considered the least valuable, but it does have some special powers that we will get into a little bit later in the video. So basically the pawn typically moves 1 square forward. But one thing that's interesting with the pawn is that the pawn actually captures differently to how it moves. And I'm going to tell you about that in a moment, but basically the pawn in general moves 1 square forward. So example, g3, black pawn moves forward, white's pawn moves forward, and you get to see the pawn is kind of just has a very, forward move, like forward, 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 because the pawn can't move backward, it can only move forward. But also the pawn has a special move as well that I want to share, because you might have noticed in that first position I showed at the start of this video that the pawns were all, on this second rank here, or on the, as you can see, like this. And if the pawn hasn't moved or previously in the game, then the pawn has a special power where it can actually move 2 squares forward on its first move only. So that means in this position, white could actually move this pawn 2 squares forward, kind of like a superpower, like, we've been running this far and let's jump and do a special move. And what if black does the same special move and moves his pawn 2 squares forward? You can see from the highlighting that these are the, the 2 possible moves for the pawn here. Well, after this, now this is where we see the way the pawn moves is different to how the pawn captures, where in this position to capture a pawn, we can only capture 1 square diagonally forward. So it's kind of like a bit like the bishop, but the difference is they can only capture 1 square forward and it can't move backward. So we would capture their pawn by playing g pawn takes the f pawn here. Or conversely, if it was black making the capture, we would see that in this case it would be black taking the pawn in this position, moving 1 square diagonally forward from their perspective. So there are some more special rules with the pawns that we will get to. But now that you know this, you actually know how each of the pieces move as such. So just remember to support this video, just make sure to like it. And also consider subscribing to get more of my Chess Grandmaster content so that you can win more of your chess games. It all helps to boost the algorithm, and very grateful for your support. With that being said, let's now get into the special rules of chess. So the thing is that it's not just about moving the pieces, but there are also some special moves that the different pieces can make. And ones that if you're, let's say, playing your first game of chess and you don't know these rules, someone might play against you and be like, hey, you can't do that. Yes, you can. No, you can't. Yes, you can. And to avoid these kinds of disagreements, let's make sure we know the special rules to get the advantage over our opponents. The first rule I want to share also relates to the pawns, and the special move of the pawn is called promotion. So how does promotion work? Basically, the way promotion works is that you can, when your pawn gets to the opponent's end of the board, like here, you can actually choose to replace the pawn. Well, the pawn then becomes a different piece, where you can choose to either promote it to a queen, which is usually the best option to promote to a queen because it's the most powerful piece, to promote to a rook, to promote to a bishop, or to promote to a knight. So in this case, we can see that in this position here, white can promote his pawn to a queen. And that's the thing with the pawns that makes it really special, because even though they start out the least valuable piece, if they get to the end of the board, then they become the most powerful piece on the board. So it shows you, don't underestimate the pawn, because you never know when it's going to suddenly become the hero of the game. And the way black promotes is the same, where black gets his pawn to the opponent's end of the board, and it would make sense to promote to a queen. If you want to see how the under promotion would look, let's say if we promoted to a rook, then that's how it would appear, with a rook promoting. And this is also to help you recognize which piece is which when you are playing, on online chess as well, because that's probably where most of you are going to be playing. Also promoting to a bishop, you can see how that looks here, and even promoting to a knight. You can see the different promotion to the different pieces, just to make sure we're all on the same page here and know our options, as it were. So let's move on to another special rule, and this is another special rule relating to the pawns. I know that with this rule, this is one that a lot of players, they say, oh yeah, you can't do that, but actually it turns out you can. So let's say that we push our pawn forward and we move our pawn like this. Now, black might remember that special rule from before of, oh, I can push my pawn 2 squares forward on the first move. And so he plays this pawn move here. And this is where the special rule comes in, where let's imagine that black had instead pushed the pawn 1 square forward. Well, then you might remember the way the pawn captures, that the pawn captures 1 square diagonally, and white would be able to take the pawn. Now, the really special rule is that when they have pushed their pawn 2 squares forward, let's say 1 square to the left or to the right of our pawn, then this is where our special move comes in, where just on this move only, we have the option to actually capture their pawn in a way that's known as en passant, which is French for in passing. So who would have thought you learned some other languages as well when learning chess? And so basically we can take it as if that pawn had only moved 1 square. And it's quite useful, obviously, to take the opponent's pawn in this way for free. But if we were to play one more move, let's say we move the king and they move their king, well then in that case you wouldn't be able to play en passant anymore, because you only had one chance to play it and you missed your chance. So you can't just make a move and then play en passant later. If you're going to play en passant, then you have to do it on this exact move where it is first available. So that's how it works. Pawn moves 1 square forward here, and then we see if black pushes a pawn, or it also works with the other side, that if they push a pawn 2 squares forward next to our pawn, then we can take it as if they only move the pawn 1 square forward, 1 square diagonally. We take 1 square diagonally as such. So yeah, that's en passant. And actually I have another example of en passant as well. And this one is showing it from black's perspective, where let's say if black pushes his pawn 1 square forward, and white pushes the pawn 2 square forward next to the pawn, well, can we take en passant as black? Well, the answer is yes, we can. We can take their pawn. And those of you who are really astute might even notice that your pawn is only 2 squares from promoting to a queen. So black will even get to use 2 special rules in the game to bring out the inner superpower of the pawn. So let's get into another example. And this is showing you about the attack on the king. Because one question you've probably had as well, it's all good, Max, to know how the pieces move, but how do you actually win the game? And the way you win the game is basically by effectively, well, not necessarily taking the opponent's king, but this part that I'm going to show you here is part of it. So let's say, what if we attack the opponent's king? Let's say we move our queen and attack the king like this. Well, then this would be known as a check. And so a check is basically when the king comes under attack by one of the opponent's pieces. So obviously, blighted these move like this, like if you push the king next to the king, it would be illegal. So we wouldn't be able to play that move, and it's not an example of a check. So a check is when one side makes a move that attacks the other side's king. And of course, it's not a case where black is able to get out of the check, where he can move his king to a safe square. And well done if you notice that you can indeed play capture and win their rook as a nice little tactic. They can give you a bit of an advantage against an unsuspecting opponent. But let's get into the next example, where I want to show something really funny, because a question you might have is, well, Max, can you meet a check with a check of your own? And the answer is that there are some cases where you can. Where, let's say, for example, I give a check, like check, check, check. Then, after queen g5, let's say that black king moves away. You'll see that suddenly there's a counter check against the king, where the king is in check, and white will need to find some way to deal with the check. First, you're wondering about the different ways to get out of check. Well, the first way is to move the king. The second is to block with a piece, to block the check with a piece. And the third is to capture the opponent's checking piece. Obviously, not all of these options will be available in every case. Like here, we can see there's no way to take the opponent's checking queen as such. But those are things to keep in mind, because it fits in really well to the next special rule I'm going to be sharing with you now. So for our next example, well, I also want to show you another special example where you might wonder, can two pieces give check at the same time? And the answer is yes, they can. Where in this position, if white were to move his bishop to check the king, well, you're not just checking the king, but you're also with the bishop, but you're also checking with the rook. And against a double check, black would have to move the king, because you can't block two checks, and you can't take two checking pieces at the same time. That would be like too much of a magic trick. So moving on to the next thing I want to show you. Well, what about a case where you give a check and your opponent isn't able to get out of the check in any way? Well, this, my friends, is known as a checkmate. So let's say I put my queen on this square here. Then we see that the three ways to get a check out of check that I mentioned. Well, black doesn't have a safe move for the king because they're all covered by the queen, or in this case the white king. And also black can't block the check here. And black can't take the checking piece with the king, because then his own king would be in check from the white king. So it'd be an illegal move by black. So that means that this is checkmate. And when you checkmate the opponent's king, then congratulations, you win the game. So now you know how to win a chess game, basically checkmate the opponent's king. Now, some players may resign and give up before you end up checkmating him, but basically the aim is to checkmate their king. There are also other checkmates as well, where you can see that, if we put the queen here, for example, that this would also be a checkmate, as black isn't able to get out of check, either by moving the king, by blocking, or by taking the checking piece. None of those options are available, and the black king is indeed in check, so therefore it is a checkmate. Let's move on to see another instance. And this is a really special rule, actually, because what happens if you can't make a move, but you're not in check? Well, there's kind of a bit of a no man's land known as stalemate. And basically the way stalemate works is, let's say, if black were to put his king here and just completely stop the white king from moving. Well, the reason it's a stalemate is because there's no legal move for white. We can't move the king here because the pawn will take it. And these two moves are covered by the king. However, the key thing is that the white king is not currently in check. So because white has no legal moves, he doesn't have a way to move any other pieces because he doesn't have any other pieces on the board here. That means that the game would end in a draw. And keep in mind that stalemate is something that if you are losing, you can often save the game, especially when you're starting out in chess, by getting the opponent to stalemate you somehow. And if you're winning, then stalemate is kind of what you want to avoid, because it would allow your opponent to escape with a draw if you accidentally stalemated their king. So now that we know about the difference between checkmate and stalemate, that checkmate is when we check their king and they can't get out of the check, and stalemate is when they don't have any legal moves but they're not in check. Then let's move on to the next special rule I have for you. And this is the only way that you can legally move two pieces at the same time in a chess game. And the way it works, it's known as castling. So what's so special about castling? Well, as you know, castling, it's a move where you move your king and your rook at the same time, and in a sense improve the position of two of your pieces at once. So there are a lot of different requirements for kingside castling, but here we can see that our key squares of f1 and g1 are basically free in this case. So the way it works is that we move our king on our move 2 squares to the right, and then when I do this, you'll notice what the rook does after that. That the rook also moves 2 squares, kind of jumping over the king, kind of like a little sort of jump over, It's like, and you said towers couldn't jump. Well, I proved you wrong there. But okay, these jokes aside, you can see how the position now looks, where the white king has moved 2 squares to the right, and the white rook has moved 2 squares to the left. And what if black were to castle in response? Well, then we see the same thing here, that the black king moves 2 squares, and then the rook, in this case the king's rook, because it's on the king's side, jumps over the king, and we get the castling position for black. So there you are, that's how to castle in a game of chess, at least castling on the king's side. Now you might be wondering, are there other ways that you can castle? And the answer is yes, there are indeed other ways in which you can castle your king. So let's continue our example here. So what if you want to castle queenside? Now more often you'll castle kingside than queenside, because you can kind of get your pieces out of the way more quickly to clear the way for castling. But in this case we see that the way that we would castle queenside is actually very similar to what we saw with kingside castling. The key thing to remember is that in both cases the king moves 2 squares. In this case it moves 2 squares to the left for white. And then you see after I move the king there that the rook then jumps over. But the difference being that the rook jumps over 3 squares where you castle long. But the easy way to remember it is just to remember that the rook basically jumps, over the king, like just basically next to the king in this way, but jumping over the king as it were. So there you have it. That's how the long castling works for white. What if black were to castle long? Well, then it's the same thing, that the king moves 2 squares to the left. And then with queenside castling, we see the rook then jumps over, where it moves so that it is next to the king, but has jumped over the king in the process. So that's how queenside castling works. And you might think it's that simple, but you know the thing of like how there are different rules, like, oh, this is such a cool game and I can't wait to start playing. And it's like, oh, but you need to know about this rule and this rule and this rule. Fortunately, it's not that hard, as I will show you here. So the way that castling works is that with castling, you're not allowed to castle so that your king is in check. So for example, you can't castle in this position because then their rook could take your king. So it would be an illegal move in this case. And if your opponent does play a legal move, like you probably, like I know I've seen different kids taunt, they say, illegal move, like arbiter, illegal move. But okay, going back to this position, to the next position rather. Well, another point is that you also can't castle when your king is in check. I mean, yeah, it would be funny if you could, like, say, haha, I castled out a check, take that. But it's not possible. You do have to deal with the check first, in this case. So, yeah, you can't castle as white, castling out of check. And another point that I also want to share is that you also can't castle, you can't castle out of check. Like, this is another example here, where let's say if black were to give a check here, then again, you can't castle out of the check because, well, your king is in check as such. So, for another example, another one that a lot of people get confused with, this I'll give you an advantage over your opponents, is that your king also can't castle through check. So you might notice that the bishop here on a6 is controlling this square between the king and the rook. And so it's not possible for you to castle because in order to get to g1, your king would first have to kind of take a little journey along f1 along the way, but then it would get taken by the king. Kind of like sort of a, bandwagon, like going from city to city, and the bandits are kind of hiding and waiting to sort of spring on them. And then sort of the bishop on a6 is kind of like that bandit stopping the king being able to castle. So you can't castle your king if you're castling through check with the king. Next point that I want to share is that you also can't castle if your king has moved or if your rook has moved previously. So we can see here that the rooks have already moved. But let's say if you were to move your rook back again. Well, it turns out black can still castle in this position safely. Let's say we castle long. It's true that the rook has moved through check. But you can still castle if the rook moves through an attack. But you can't castle if a king moves through an attack. That's an important distinction. But you can see that white isn't able to castle his king because the rook had already moved beforehand. And if the king had moved back and forth, then it would be the same story. That once your king has moved, you can't castle anymore. And once your rook has moved, you can't castle anymore with that rook. So that's kind of an important point that, let's say, for example, if black had moved his rook, then he can't castle queenside anymore, even if the rook moves back. However, you can still castle with your other rook that hasn't moved yet, because your king hasn't moved. So I think that clarifies it so it all makes sense for you. Let's now continue with the next example. So basically, in this position here, you can castle long with this here. but you wouldn't be able to castle with the king's rook at any point in the game. So now we're all on the same page with that. Let's see about the different ways the game can end in a draw. We already know the main one of stalemate, where stalemate is basically, as like I said before, when your king is not in check, but where you don't have any legal move that you can make and it's your turn, then the game would end in a draw. Or conversely, if it's the opponent's turn to move, they're not in check, but they don't have any legal moves they can make with any of their pieces. Another type of draw is insufficient material, where even though white has an extra knight on the board, there's just no way legally for any series legal moves to checkmate the opponent's king, and therefore the game would just end in a draw one way or another. Another way that the game can end in a draw is also the 50 move rule. And basically the way the 50 move rule works is that let's say you play 50 moves for white and 50 moves for black, where basically there hasn't been any pawn moves, and there haven't been any captures either in those 50 moves, then that means that the players can claim a draw, and the game will end in a draw once that draw claim is made successfully. And this position is an example where you can see that, it's just a complete sort of impasse where there's no way through either of these structures. So the players, if they want to, they could play 50 moves each, but then, one of the players could claim a draw and end the game in this way. Another way that the game can end in a draw is also by a free-fall repetition of the position. And so these are sort of more advanced rules, so some of you may be happy just to start playing and learn the rules as you go, but for those who really want to master the rules and know every little key important rule of chess, then this will make sure you're fully covered. So basically here, a draw by free-fall repetition is when the exact same position, that is the exact same piece on the same squares, same side to move in each of those three positions, and also the same available moves for both sides. When all of that happens, the game ends in a draw by free-fall repetition. So an example would be, let's say I give a check to the king. Well, black's only move is to move the king out of check like this. We would give another check with the king, to the king with the queen. Again, black has only one legal move. And we sort of see that after queen h5 that the same position has now happened twice. And then after queen e8, king h7, and queen to h5, we see that the same position has occurred 3 times. And that would allow the players to claim a draw. Either side could claim a draw here, and the game would end in a draw from this point. So there you are. That's how the draw by free-fall repetition works. This particular version where we see the king is being checked over and over again by the piece, well, that's known as an example of a perpetual check if you want to get really technical. So that's how a draw by free-fall repetition works. It's basically when the exact same position arises 3 times. The same pieces are on the same squares, the same side to move, and the same available moves for each side in each of the positions, each of the 3 positions. So now that we've covered that, let's see what the starting position is for chess. And I'm just going to take a moment to make sure that we have everything all covered. So yeah, this is going to be just to show you the starting position. Now, if you're playing in with actual physical chess pieces, there's actually a very easy way to remember this order of the pieces. One thing you're going to notice is that the tallest pieces are in the middle. So you have the queen and the king in the middle, the king being the absolute tallest piece and the queen being only very slightly shorter. And then you're going to notice that after that, then the bishops are kind of the next tallest piece. So they sort of go between the queen and the king as the tallest pieces. And then the next tallest pieces are the knights, which I've highlighted in green here. So then you have the knights after that. And then finally the rooks are the shortest pieces. So you have the rooks as the pieces sort of on the very end because they're the shortest. So if you're playing with a physical board, that's a really easy way to remember where your pieces should go. Another thing that you might also notice if you're really observant is that the position of the queen. Well, you might notice that the queen is positioned on the square of her color. So the white queen is on a white square. You might know of it as a light square. And the black queen is on a black square or a dark square here. So that's something important to keep in mind, because when you're playing your first games of chess on a physical board, you might notice that some players will put the king and the queen the wrong way around. So if you remember the queen goes on her color, in order to feel like part of the kingdom, then you're going to be able to make sure you're playing from the correct starting position. And the pawns are more straightforward because the pawns just go in front of the other pieces. So it's pretty easy to remember that the pawns all go here like this. Now, also another thing you can also keep in mind is it might help you to also make a little mnemonic as well to try to remember which piece goes where. So you can say rook in the... Well, I'm trying to think how I can make it a fun rhyme because I'm kind of doing it off the top of my head. We could say the rook in the corner gets a good look. The knight in between is everything to be seen. The bishop over here. Between the queen and king we dare. And then the queen on her color and the king is the other. So there you go. You probably came up with a better one like in the time, but that's just an example of how you can make it. Like, sometimes the more silly it sounds, like the better you remember it, because it's kind of special, right? So okay, that's how the starting position works. And then I'm just going to show you finally an example game where we sort of put some of these rules of chess together so that you can kind of see them in action. And it's also a fun little story to wrap up the rules of chess explained. So let's say, for example, that we put our pawn, where we know that the pawn can move 2 squares forward on its first move. So white does this, and black says, hey, that's a really cool special move. I'm going to do that as well. So pawn here. And then white says, oh, now that I move the pawn, like, it's not like the bishop is like stuck like and can't jump over the pawns. But now my queen can move, and I'm going to use the queen's power and bring the queen out. And it's at this point that black accidentally touches his king, like he knocks the king over and says, oh no, I didn't mean to move my king. Please, I don't want to have to move the king. And the white player says, you touch it, you move it. And so black says, oh, fine, I'll move my king here. Bring the king up. And then now white sort of pounces and sees, oh, the queen captures the same way that it moves. And so white plays queen takes pawn. And when he says, check. But then he thinks for a bit longer, like his opponent's thinking, wondering what he should do. It says, hang on, it's checkmate. So why is it checkmate? Because, well, the black king can't take its own pieces. So black king has no move in this position. If you were to move the king here, it would still be in check. Say if the king goes here or here or here, the queen is covering all of it. And black can't block the check with any of his pieces either. And finally the king can't, do a like king power move and take the queen, because the king only moves 1 square at a time. So there you have it. It's checkmate in this position. So there you are. Those are the rules of chess explained. And you also notice that by learning from a grandmaster, not only have you learned the rules of chess, but I've actually shared with you a few little tips along the way. I haven't spelled them out too directly, but you're going to notice that where you'll be able to use some of the ideas I mentioned to actually get an advantage over your opponents. So that way you're not just knowing how to play chess, like in terms of the rules, but you also know a few little tips and tricks so that I get some quick wins against other casual players. I didn't meant to say that I would show you the best places to play online. The two sites that I would recommend most of all are chess.com, and I will include these links in the description, by the way. I recommend chess.com first, but I also recommend leadchess.org as being another good site as well, where you just create a free account on there and you can start playing games right away against humans or even against computers, depending on who would rather play first. And also, if you are a young kid, you also might consider playing on Chess Kid, which is kind of very kid-friendly, designed to make it all fun and interesting and all that. So you can choose the one that appeals the most to you, where I put the links in the description to make sure you've got that. So yeah, congratulations! You now know how to play chess. You know all of the rules, including all of the special rules that a lot of your opponents are actually not going to know, fellow beginners. So you've got a head start on them. As always, thank you so much for your attention in watching this video. I'm really excited to see you on the next video to show you more chess tips to give you the unfair advantage over your next opponents. And so I will see you there, everyone.